Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series brought to you by the Environmental Law Center here at Vermont Law School. Apologies for the delay. That was a tech problem on my end, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in these virtual days. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs. I'm going to bring up a list of resources on the screen to direct you to some of the programs at the Environmental Law Center for those of you looking to learn more. You can also view our full Hot Topics lineup by going to the website vermontlaw.edu/hot-topics. Each of these talks is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records if you're looking to get that credit. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of today's presentation, so please type your question in the chat box at any time during the lecture, and we'll get to as many as we can. Today, we are pleased to welcome Arjun Krishnaswami and Grant Carlisle. Arjun Krishnaswami is an analyst with NRDC's Natural Resource Defense Council's Climate and Clean Energy Program. He leverages modeling and analysis to support policy solutions that accelerate the clean energy transition, focusing on policy in the Western states and at the federal level. Prior to his current role, Krishnaswami was a Schneider Fellow at NRDC, where he focused on promoting energy efficiency and renewable energy through federal legislation and the U.S. Department of Energy Innovation programs. He holds a bachelor's degree in environmental systems engineering and a master's in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University, and he's based in Washington, D.C. Grant Carlisle is a senior policy advisor for NRDC's Climate and Clean Energy program. He previously served as the federal policy director for E2, Environmental Entrepreneurs, and worked for Congressman Heath Shuler, Democrat from North Carolina. He received a bachelor's in political science from UNC at Nashville, and he's also based in Washington, D.C. Today, our speakers will present a talk called Building Back Smarter, a Post-COVID America. Please join me in welcoming Arjun Krishnaswami and Grant Carlisle.
Thank you so much,
Hi.
Jenny, for the introduction, and for having us come talk to you about our work on the stimulus and the recovery efforts. So we'll just jump in. We have some slides we'll share, and then we'll have some time for questions, discussion at the end. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. All right, I think that should work. So Grant and I are going to talk through building back smarter and the work that we at NRDC with some of our partners are doing to develop and advocate for policies to help the country recover from the crises we're facing. And I'll start with just giving some context for why this work is important to us and the crises that we're starting with. And then where we're headed if the federal government doesn't intervene with policy, and then our vision of where we must go and how we actually get there, how we change course, and then we'll talk a bit about some of the specific campaigns we're working on around tax and some of our litigation that's relevant. So to jump in, I mean, as you all know, we're obviously facing interlocking crises that center on the coronavirus crisis, and I want to walk through just some sort of breeze through some slides with some data on the crises we're facing and how they're all connected, and in particular, we're thinking about this as not just the coronavirus crisis, but the other crises that it intersects with, the crisis of economic inequality and systemic racism that this current pandemic is built upon, and then also the climate emergency and how that's connected to these other two crises that we're facing. So obviously, we're at a point where coronavirus cases are rising rapidly. They dipped for a little bit in this country, but are now on the uptick. And immediately as I'm sure many or all of you have seen, the impacts of the coronavirus are deeply connected with race and histories of racial inequality in this country. With these data showing Black and Latinx people facing much higher rates of coronavirus, and also higher rates of hospitalization, higher death rates. We can see immediate links between the racial inequality in this country and the current pandemic. And then we can also see relationships between race and environmental risk and environmental exposure, as which is key to what NRDC works on, being historically an organization that focuses on addressing environmental pollution. There's very clear links between race and environmental pollution. This slide just shows how much more risk Black and Latinx people take on from environmental pollution. And then those, both race and environmental pollution are linked to COVID. So you can see, this is just looking at the relationship between places where environmental risk is high and the COVID death rate. And you can see even if the environmental pollution is not causing higher death rate, you can see that it's very much connected to the same communities that are experiencing high environmental pollution are those that are also experiencing much higher death rates from the pandemic. In addition to the public health crisis, we're also facing serious economic crisis. You've all seen this chart or a similar chart of unemployment reaching record levels. If you overlay that with race, you see that that Black and Latinx people experience much higher, have been experiencing much higher unemployment as a result of the COVID crisis, and that again builds on these long histories of systemic racism and structural racism in the country. So I start with all of that, even though I think a lot of it is information that you've already that most of us have seen or have read in this time period, because I think as we at NRDC are approaching our advocacy around envisioning a world after COVID, we have to think about the ways that the various crises that we're facing are connected, and that's our starting point. And then I want to talk a little bit about where we're headed. Obviously, the coronavirus crisis is far from over, but we're also heading into other really serious aspects of the crisis as well. We're heading toward an eviction crisis. This is an analysis from the Aspen Institute and a project set up to help prevent evictions during the pandemic. And they found that by September, 19 to 23 million people are at risk of eviction, high risk of eviction based on rent burden and disposable income. So we're about to head into another aspect of this crisis without policy intervention. Then we can also look at the long, obviously we're facing really significant near-term health and economic consequences, but we're also facing down economic consequences in the long run. And this is from an analysis from Rhodium Group, who we work with quite a bit on our energy system analysis. And what they found is that even if you look at various scenarios for economic recovery, we still don't expect the economic output to match up with what we expected it to look like pre-COVID levels. And there's a Rhodium looked at studies of crises over the past 200 years and found that it takes a long time for the economy to recover after a crisis, even if it even recovers at all. So that could be anywhere. The median time it took for the economy to recover was about 6 or 7 years, and after many crises, the economy never actually made it back to the levels that were expected. So the reason I include this here is because I think as we're thinking about our work for building back after this crisis, it's a long fight, and it requires long-term solutions, and we sort of have to ground ourselves in that if we're going to push for investments and policies to get out of this. And another aspect of this, in addition to unemployment and evictions and the public health crisis, is that state budgets and local budgets are imperiled, which that's true this year, but it will also be true in the coming years as states have lost a lot of the economic activity that brings them revenue, whether it's from tourism or from people buying things and sales taxes, or from fossil fuel leasing and production. The states are losing their revenue, and a lot of states have restrictions on how much debt they can go into and how they can generate additional revenue. So we're facing down this additional crisis where state and local governments who provide education and healthcare in addition to energy services are struggling and likely not going to be able to meet all the needs of their constituents without some sort of intervention. So again, when we're coming at our work around economic recovery, we want to think about what the world might look like without any intervention. And state and local governments are obviously key to both providing for people, but also for our energy and climate work. Then, we can also think about what are the impacts of the crisis on the energy system. And we saw pretty much unprecedented declines in demand for fossil fuels during the crisis. And that shocked the fossil fuel production system, likely means that some fossil fuel producers and power plants are going under or might not make it out of the crisis. Similarly, we saw really significant cuts to industrial production, what heavy industry produces. And for steel, that was the most significant, 36% reduction in May from May of 2019. And again, this means that some of these companies either won't, that produce products to build things might not make it out of the crisis, or will need support to make it out of this crisis. And that opens up a lot of questions about what does recovery funding look like, and how does it ensure that we build our industry back in a way that that is climate friendly, that is thinking long term, and that is more equitable. So I include these in here because I think that we really have to think about how do the hits that the energy system is taking, how do those lead us to decisions about recovery policy. So that is where the nation is heading. Some sort of snippets of information on where we sort of think about where the nation is heading after this crisis, and our work to try to get a recovery package, or to get federal intervention to build back smarter, is grounded in a vision of what the world could look like if we do so. And as we're thinking about that, we've set ourselves up with several guiding principles. These are from a long list of groups that developed what's called the 5 Principles of Just COVID-19 Relief, emphasizing that health has to be the top priority. We have to provide economic relief directly to the people. We have to provide relief and recovery for workers and communities. And we have to think long term, make a down payment on a regenerative economy, and then finally protect our democratic process during this crisis. And these feed into the sorts of policies that we have been advocating for, and the way that we're thinking about recovery. And in particular, we're thinking about it in terms of relief and then also recovery, which is also the distinction, of course, that the federal policymakers have made. And within the relief conversation, which we'll spend a little less time talking about, our priorities have been that we have to protect people from the start, expand assistance so that people can pay their rent and their energy and water bills, extend a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, a federal moratorium, provide other sorts of assistance for vulnerable populations, ranging from support for people experiencing homelessness to unemployment insurance to food assistance and so on. And then as we think about supporting industry, to ensure that that industry support actually goes to workers. And that if there is support for corporations or industry, that it's conditioned on protecting the workers who are suffering. And then moving into long-term recovery, this is really where we've been working on policy development related to long-term recovery towards a better world that's more resilient to future crises, building out diversified economies that are more resilient to future crises, building in strong social safety nets and labor protections, building out energy, transportation, and industrial systems that are pollution-free and don't show such high levels of environmental risk that I mentioned earlier, and then building wealth in low-income communities of color that are being hit the hardest from this crisis and from the environmental crisis as well. And then we must prepare for the future crises and prepare for the climate emergency through building out clean energy, building clean infrastructure, and also building out infrastructure that's resilient to climate impacts. So all of that leads us to what what are the policies and investments that we're advocating for at the federal level to change course, to set our sights on a post-COVID world that is stronger, more resilient, cleaner, more equitable. And we have three major categories of asks within that federal policy. The first is to support state and local governments. The second is to make huge federal investments in clean and healthy infrastructure. And the third is to support and expand the workforce. And we believe that if the federal government were actually to step up to the task and do these three things, that we could really address these crises in a way that makes people's lives better off. And there's a lot here. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about any one of these recommendations. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, and there will be some specifics on the slides, but I'll talk about them in broad strokes. These are where we have been focusing our efforts on how Congress could provide a recovery package that we think could actually help us in the long term create economic recovery and build a cleaner by building out a cleaner energy and industrial system. So first, as I said, this first major, most immediate challenge is to support states and cities, and we think the federal government can do that with flexible funding that allows the states and cities to fill in their budgets, fill in lost revenue, and continue to provide services to people in this time of crisis. And then also open federal financing for states. So use existing financing authority that the federal government has to allow states to lend to states and allow states to use that money in this time of crisis. And then finally, really relevant to our clean energy climate work is to provide funding directly to the states for clean energy buildings and transportation. These are some of the specific programs that we have been advocating for and care a lot about from programs at the Department of Energy that can provide financing to states to some programs at other departments like the Department of Housing and Urban Development and to other just straight up funding to state governments. Then within this second, a lot of the recommendations and the policies that we've been pushing fit within this second category of making a massive federal investment, using federal spending power to put people back to work, building out a more equitable and clean and healthy economy. And there's a whole set of policy recommendations and tools within what we think should be within a massive federal investment. And within that, these are just some of the big ticket items. We think we should use the tax code, which Grant will talk about later. And then, there's lots of areas that at this nexus of systemic racism, the economic impacts of the pandemic, and the climate emergency, where there's investments in programs that are just really effective at addressing those three crises. For example, upgrading the nation's building stock, which both reduces energy use and emissions, makes homes healthier and safer, and we know that low-income people and communities of color tend to live in homes that are less efficient, pay more of their income for energy services, and it doesn't have to be that way. And then third, of course, that upgrading our built environment is really jobs intensive and can put people to work in high quality jobs if we design these programs right. Similarly, we need to build out our transportation systems. We need to modernize the electricity grid. These aspects of our energy using infrastructure that are just really out of date and need improvements and expansion. And these are really specific. These are some of the specific programs that we've been advocating for, both existing federal programs that you could really expand and new ones as well. Also on this list are some other policies. So, for example, launching a national infrastructure bank, which would touch a lot of the various infrastructure projects that I've talked about, but would provide one large centralized source of funding and financing to improve our infrastructure, make it cleaner, cut climate warming pollution, and also make it safer and more affordable and more efficient. Then, I think this is really important to recovery, is expanding domestic manufacturing. I included the slide here, the chart here on cutting industrial production. One of the things we're focusing on is how do you, given the downturn in industrial production and the economic forecast that we're expecting, one way that you might be able to close that gap is by building out domestic manufacturing of clean energy, of clean industrial products, and preparing not only to facilitate the transition to a clean energy economy, but also to develop really jobs-intensive industries. And there are several other here: investing in environmental cleanup, supporting innovation, and other less not necessarily energy-related, but still very important economic development programs. And finally, we think that we need to really expand the federal government's role in supporting and expanding the workforce. That means fostering a just transition, which is really about supporting workers in polluting industries, workers in the fossil fuel industry, as we transition to a clean economy. That means training new workers for industries that are important to a clean economy, and ensuring that all the jobs that we create are high quality. And here are some of the specific recommendations. There are existing programs, but really what we've been advocating for is a rethinking of the federal government's role in workforce development and in protecting workers in the industries we're talking about investing in. So I'm about to turn it over to Grant to talk about some more specifics of the campaigns we're leading. I wanted to include this slide on how do all these investments actually connect to the outcomes we're talking about. And really, the way I think about it is that the effect on the world, the amount of jobs and economic recovery that that the federal government can enable is really contingent on how ambitious the policies are that we win, that Congress passes. And we see that in some of the analyses we've worked on and some of the analysis that our partners have done. If you, let's say, passed $100 billion green stimulus, you might get 300,000, 900,000 jobs for the next 5 years. But if you thought a lot bigger, $600 billion per year, then you might get to 9 million new jobs over the next 10 years, a significant portion of the people who are unemployed. And if we can think big and be ambitious and actually meet the scale of these crises that we're facing, then we might actually be able to build a cleaner and safer and more equitable economy. So Grant, I think I'm going to pass it to you to talk more in depth about tax.
Thanks. And if you can, I don't know if you can move over the screen at all. I can just read up. Oh, perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, these are issues that I specifically work on, but one of the, in general, or probably the most direct way to drive deployment of clean energy is through the tax code. So for the last several decades, slowly and in building iterations, policymakers have established at the state and federal level incentives for installing solar, typically installing solar and wind, both in a residential capacity for solar and what's called utility scale for solar and wind. There's credits for other technologies, and I'll get into that as well. But those have been the two major credits that we've seen. Part of my work over the last few years has, and along with a big coalition of other groups and colleagues like Arjun and others at NRDC, has been to ensure that we're providing longer term extensions for these tax incentives. Basically for the same reason that I just said a few moments ago, which is the most direct way to deploy renewable energy and drive down carbon emissions is through the tax code, to give basically tax breaks to companies and to individuals that are building these technologies, installing these technologies, and putting these technologies on their home. There are, again, sort of a big network of incentives that support this, but mostly what I work with are what's called the investment tax credit, which is typically utilized by solar, and the production tax credit, which is typically utilized by the wind industry. What we've been pushing for over the last couple of years, and I'll get to how this is relevant for the COVID crisis in a minute, are longer term, so like 5-year extensions for each of these. They both got 5-year extensions in the 2015 in a 2015 budget deal during the Obama administration, and they've been which gave them a few years of the full value of the credit, and now are slowly ramping down each of them, so they decrease by a certain percentage of value every year. What has happened in the industry, in both those industries, but also in several other technologies that we care about because they help us, again, drive down carbon emissions. The EV, the electric vehicle industry, for instance, energy storage, which is really critical to, as I'm sure you all know, getting a lot of these electrons from these sources of energy onto the grid. Basically, and I don't mean to explain anything that people already know, but the easy thing about sources like natural gas or coal, for instance, usually called baseload sources of power, is that they're collected from many different places, but then all shipped to one facility that burns them, and then the lines into the transmission lines onto the grid emanate from there. So it's really easy because it's one sort of central place. Solar and wind, of course, are what's called distributed. They're all over the place. You'll have, some turbines over here and some turbines over there, and you have to get the energy, usually in very rural places that don't have a lot of transmission lines, and you have to get them to facilities. So, and of course, the wind is not always blowing, the sun is not always shining. So one of the big problems the last couple of decades with these technologies that's pretty rapidly being solved through technology is energy storage. You need a place to put that energy before, either in a residence, if that home has solar panels on it, or more than likely as sort of a utility scale version of that, so that it can then be shipped onto a certain grid through certain transmission lines to sort of a power facility that can use it, or utility that can use it. So again, we're looking at driving deployment of wind and solar technologies, also energy storage through the tax code. Right now, we're pushing for opening up the investment tax credit, which has typically been utilized, again, by solar for energy storage as well. It already applies to solar energy, but this would ensure that it could apply to, and only for batteries. But this would ensure basically that other energy storage technologies can be utilized and for other sources of energy. And so we're looking at, again, credits for energy storage, solar, wind, the electric vehicle space. So lifting a cap on that credit and extending it. There's been a cap when this credit was established in the late recession that caps all original manufacturers, so the big car companies, at 200,000 units. So in other words, once they've sold 200,000 cars of a certain type, consumers buying that car can no longer apply for the credit. So this would be lifting that cap to 400 or 500,000 units sold for each company. And then finally, generally have been looking at extending the life of the investment tax credit for offshore wind as well, as that industry, which has been very nascent, as you all probably know. I think there's one operating installation now and several in development and many, many more planned in a lot of states. So ensuring that that as the Trump administration has dragged its heels on approving offshore leases through the Department of Interior, those companies are still able to utilize the credit and use it. Now, all of this has to do with the COVID crisis. These industries collectively have lost about 600,000 jobs over the past few months. The vast majority of those have actually been in an industry that I didn't really mention, but energy efficiency, which also has a set of tax credits that are applicable to it and that we're also working on. But there's been huge losses in solar and wind. Any developments in offshore wind have basically stopped to a halt. People are not really buying EVs like they were. So what we're looking at is opening up those credits. And sort of a big part of my job is talking to members of Congress right now that are putting together relief legislation and showing the job losses in their states and districts and ensuring that we are trying to do something through relief and recovery legislation. Obviously, our priority there is on, the healthcare of everyone in their states, or the health rather of everyone in their states and the healthcare, and ensuring that we're getting out funds to these states that they need to use, but also trying to look at, what sort of industries have been really hurt in this process. And just because, frankly, we don't have a lot of time to deal with the climate crisis, we have to get going as fast as we can, ensuring that we're still ramping up renewables. One of the, not necessarily good things, but sort of a funny thing I think that Arjun alluded to before during all of this has been, it has laid bare for a lot of investment firms, the volatility of the fossil fuel market. So it's possible if we set up clean energy companies in a good way and ensure that they are able to take advantage of sort of the moment, hopefully after this crisis passes, that we're going to see a lot of growth, a lot further deployment, a lot of big drop in carbon emissions in the next few years. That's what we're hoping. So we're trying to push for policymakers to give flexibility to a lot of these credits. So instead of companies, they usually get paid back at a very slow rate over time, and there's really complex financing mechanisms that are involved. They need big banks that are able to give them large loans. I mean, if you're constructing, the average wind farm is about 35 turbines. That's a big project that takes several years and a lot of workers to construct. So you need a lot of financing. Typically what happens is the banks themselves take on the credit and then they get paid back very slowly. What these developers that we're trying to help with the need is what's typically been referred to as direct pay. I often refer to it as refundability or flexibility, which basically means you're able to pay back at a much quicker rate, perhaps with taking a haircut off of that. So a certain percentage that might be taken out through financing, but giving that to companies to sort of shore them up. They're able to keep workers on the books. They're able to not have projects fall through. So that's a big part of what we're looking at in the very near term, is ensuring that Congress is looking at the best ways to ensure that this industry just doesn't, right as it's really hitting its stride in the last few years, we've seen huge jumps in solar and wind installations. The amount of folks that are employed in these industries collectively and energy efficiency are about 3.3 million. And then, as I said, we've seen over 500,000 jobs evaporate in a number of months, which obviously the entire economy is taking a huge hit. But we're trying to ensure that, especially a lot of these, the vast majority of the clean energy industry is small companies, small installers, and contractors. So we're trying to ensure that there's a marketplace for them to come back to once we hopefully see, an end after the worst of the virus passes to some of the social distancing measures. There's big problems with supply chains, and then once the financing comes back. So basically, it's shoring them up until then. Now, in this slide, I call them tax extenders. That's because you have to, typically what's happened is that these get extended at the end of every year or every other year by Congress for a year or two. And so we've also been discussing for a long time what would be called a tech neutral tax shift or tech neutral approach. This would establish, in the model that Arjun and I've often worked on and looked at, and some members of Congress have driven, basically an approach to energy tax policy which would reward lower carbon emission sources of energy. Now, this isn't something that we are in the short term planning on, as in this year. Perhaps with a change in leadership in certain bodies of Congress and other parts of the government, that is something that we could really visit. But ultimately, nobody wants to keep on coming back and extending these credits every couple of years, including the industry themselves. They'd much rather sort of an overall approach that looks at, well, what are our values in the energy space as a nation, as that applies to public health, jobs, investing in the types of energy that we need to, and how do we drive that over the long run? And so a tech neutral approach would get rid of any incentives for non-cleaner forms of energy, and reward those that are able to be deployed while driving down our carbon emissions, as I've said a few times. Arjun, can you go to the next slide? And I also want to talk about a couple of cases that we are looking at. And I will say that I am, neither is Arjun, on our litigation team who's actually doing these. So I will try my best if y'all have questions. But obviously, I know these are of great importance. So there's first the ACE rule litigation, which is, I think they're going through merits briefings right now. An oral argument is expected sometime this fall. This is NRDC and a number of like organizations suing the EPA over its replacement rule for the Clean Power Plan, which you all might have heard of. That was a regulation that was promulgated in 2015 by the Obama administration. This is the Trump administration's, I almost don't even want to call it a replacement. It's very, very different. And it would, whereas the Clean Power Plan set it up so that states would have to establish a mechanism through their utilities and their energy sector of driving down their own carbon emissions by a certain percentage. It looked at sort of the whole cake of any given state and how to drive down their emissions through whatever policies the state wanted to do. This looks at driving down emissions at individual facilities and would not do a lot overall, would not have a big impact. So that case is probably the most significant, single most significant, because it is a replacement for the national rulemaking that was setting us up not to get all the way we need to in our energy sector emissions as a country, but a lot closer to where we need to be, the Clean Power Plan, that is. The second, and I have actually worked on this quite a bit, is the vehicle standards litigation. So this is, again, NRDC and a number of our partners, including the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS, suing NHTSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation, which promulgates vehicle emission standards. So the Trump administration, as I'm sure you know, has rolled back the vehicle emission standards set by the Obama administration, which gradually increases the amount of fuel efficiency that car makers need to put in new models year over year. Car makers have never really had an issue hitting these in the past few years. They actually have more privately argued against the Trump administration because they thought this rule was too extreme. And not to mention, it is obviously good for the environment. The more efficient, vehicle emission standards you have, and good for the economy. There are literally hundreds of thousands of jobs that are in making parts to make cars more efficient, usually at outside contractors, outside of the big auto manufacturers. And I mean, it's good for consumers. Who doesn't want greater fuel efficiency in their vehicles? And especially for rural consumers, because they're driving a lot further and usually larger vehicles than folks in urban environments. So this is another case that we're suing on that could have a huge effect on the industry. Obviously, if the if our side, I guess, was able to win and they had to go back to the drawing books and promulgate a new rule, or for a new administration came in and was able to promulgate a new rule, this is going to be a huge boon to the electric vehicle industry and others that are trying to drive more efficient vehicles in the future. Obviously, a huge boon for consumers and the workers in the industry as well. The DOE process rule, a little dry of a topic, but an incredibly important case. This is the Trump administration wrapping up. If the Trump administration trying to change the way that rules are promulgated themselves. So this is federal rulemakings that come out from federal agencies, from an administration, and affect policy throughout the federal government, and very often in certain industries. This would change the process by which these rules are put together, and would give a lot more influence to outside companies to influence them, and make it a lot more difficult for the agencies themselves to promulgate the rules, to put it kind of simply. Arjun, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. And I will wrap up because I know I want to have a few, some time for questions. So really quickly, the EPA methane rule and BLM methane rule, these are both cases involving, again, rulemakings from the Obama administration. The Trump administration has tried to roll back. The EPA methane rule established guidelines by which the natural gas industry, extraction industry, had to clamp down on its methane emissions, which are obviously come from fracking and other natural gas extraction sites. Methane, they're much less than carbon emissions, but methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas. And frankly, there just wasn't a ton of data on how much methane was leaking. So the EPA set this up. The industry did not vehemently oppose it. There's actually a lot of companies that, across the board vehemently oppose it. There's actually a lot of companies that are in the business, again, of making devices to cut down on these emissions. To say nothing about the fact that it obviously helps public health when you cut down on these emissions going out. It obviously helps our fight against climate change if you're able to take a extremely potent greenhouse gas out of the air, or at least some of it. BLM is a similar rule. This is just methane emissions on public lands. It's the Bureau of Land Management is what BLM stands for in this case. And we are involved, obviously, again, in both those cases. And then, of course, you all probably read about this recent decision, but the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Supreme Court decided that it could not cross the Appalachian Trail, which was a big victory, although the companies at first said that they were still going to proceed. And then after many years, a lot of public opposition in a lot of these states, and especially the communities that the pipeline would pass through, the companies that were building it, Dominion and Duke Energy decided to just pull the plug on the pipeline. So that was a pretty recent victory, both at the litigation level and then sort of at the public health and clean energy level as well. And I am wrapped up. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Grant. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I am Courtney Collins. I'm the Assistant Director at the Environmental Law Center at Vermont Law School. And I am stepping in for Dean Rushlow as she is experiencing some technical difficulties. Thank you again for that really interesting talk. We do have a few minutes to ask some questions from our audience. As a reminder, for those of you watching on our website live stream, click on the Watch on Live Stream icon at the bottom of the video to bring up the chat box where you can add your questions. If you are watching on our Facebook live stream, you can add your question to the comment box below, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. So let's start with the first question. How does your suggested plan compare to prior efforts led by the federal government after economic crises?
So I can start. A lot of the spending programs that were that I mentioned, the investments that we think the federal government needs to make are similar to, and actually many of them are revivals or increases in funding for the same programs that were included in the Recovery Act after the recession in 2008, 2009, and that was in some ways, I think we're proposing very similar spending programs. I think that we really think that the scale of the crisis and the scale of the response needed is larger. And there were retrospective looks at the Recovery Act that said if they had the federal government invested a lot more money in similar programs, it would have quickened economic recovery, and that the amount of money spent should have been higher. I think that is a lesson for this crisis, that we should really be thinking big and pushing hard, not only on existing programs, but also on building new structures, new ways for the federal government to spend money, long-term sustained investments that can build out the infrastructure we need and support people, and then also to really expand beyond just what was in the spending programs to protections for workers and to sort of more specific responses to this crisis. So I think, we're starting from what's been done in the past, but I think it needs to be bigger.
I would just add, Arjun made a great point about this, but many of the programs that we're looking at plussing up that he discussed were established under the Recovery Act and were an enormous help in establishing a clean energy industry. It was really nascent around the time of the recession, most of it. Residential solar was kind of established. There was some utility solar, some utility wind, but it has grown by many times over in size and certainly in value. A lot of that were the investments at the Department of Energy in programs that the specific purpose of which is to drive efficiencies in those technologies. And they've been able to get those technologies into the private sector, which have in turn helped those industries grow, which I would just point out, just to kind of play the devil's advocate, for anyone that's saying, well, why are we doing this for clean energy? We've done this across the board, actually, for fossil fuels. The Department of Energy, over several decades, it established fracking, it established new technologies around oil extraction. So this isn't something new. But he's exactly right in the level of ambition. This is an economic crisis that we'll see, but some would argue in size and the sort of its rapid pace is actually worse than the Great Recession at this moment.
Great, thank you. And how does the plan compare to what other countries are doing?
So go ahead, Grant.
I was gonna say I'm that's a good question. I'm honestly not sure. I know a little bit about what's happening in Europe. I'm not quite sure about what's happening in China, for instance. Their cases went down very quickly. Yeah, I don't know what you have to add. Let me think about that for a minute.
Yeah, I think the general principles that we presented here are true for pretty much anywhere we're looking at recovery. And I think some of the European governments have been better at actually taking action on those principles in terms of providing relief directly to people, supporting people through payroll, making sure everybody has access to healthcare. Like a lot of the pieces in the relief category that we have basically failed to do in the US or have only done really band-aid fixes for. Some European countries have come out of the gate stronger on those. And then I think even in recovery, I think some of the proposals we've seen in Europe are stronger than the recoveries that the Democrats are starting with in the US in terms of actually like really leaning into infrastructure and clean energy as stimulus because of its jobs potential and its long-term benefits. Whereas there's been some resistance and hesitance to do that in the US. And I think that's something we're up against.
Thank you for that. Okay, I have one more question, which is, what are you finding in your interactions with members of Congress in terms of how much they feel they can engage in a plan like you suggest?
I would say we've already seen a really high level of ambition, maybe not where we need to be, but what was passed in earlier relief legislation earlier this year was already larger a few times over than the Recovery Act from 2009. I think that there is an ambition there for whatever reason. The budget hawks who were around in the Great Recession, that is not a culturally sort of relevant position at the moment, perhaps because this is really a public health issue, and when that's the case, maybe ancillary concerns like that are not as rated as high on priority lists. But anywho, we're seeing that even on the Republican side, depending on what kind of issue you're talking about, there's been an acceptance that they need to go big. Now, having said that, I mean, this is often like direct payments for hospitals, direct payments for, obviously there was, a single direct payment for just about every American. But for the most part, it's been loans to small businesses and larger companies, some of which have frankly gone to the wrong people. And obviously there needs to be reform there. But in terms of support for clean energy policies, up to this point, and NRDC has been very supportive of this position, despite the sort of threats to the industry and jobs. We really have been focused on public health and ensuring that the states have what they need, all Americans have what they need. We're looking at the like day-to-day issues because frankly, we're just unfortunately not out of kind of the first phase of this crisis yet. And leaving that for another time. I will say in the relief legislation we're looking at now, there has been a little bit more acceptance that they need to move beyond the set of industries that they were focused on, airlines, for instance, in the first relief legislation. So we're seeing a little bit more openness to it.
Great, thank you for that answer. I'm afraid that we are out of time now and need to wrap up today's talk. So thank you again to Arjun and Grant for your presentation today. That was really interesting. And I also want to thank our viewers for joining us today. Our next Hot Topics will take place on July 21st, and we hope that you can join us then. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.